Hi, in several videos in this channel, I've brought up the French Army's Scorpion program. In fact, in the previous video that I made about the Belgian military, I talked about how the Belgians were buying Scorpion. So I thought it was time for me to finally pull the trigger and to do a separate video about Scorpion to explain exactly what it is and why it's such a big deal. My name is Michael Shirkin and welcome to my YouTube channel, Pax Americana, a conversation about world affairs, global conflict, military strategy, and anything else that happens to be on my mind. And of course, if you like this video, please hit the like and subscribe. It really helps my channel a great deal. And if you feel so inclined and inspired to help this channel even in a more direct way, you've got two options now. For one thing, if you look at the bottom of the screen, there's a thanks button you could do. There's also a membership thing that you can do so that you can sign up for a membership. So thanks is for the like money in a tip jar. Membership is more an enduring thing. Likewise, in the description, there's a link to buy me a coffee where likewise you can put some money in the tip jar or also do a membership. Thank you very much. I really appreciate it. All right, so let's get to this. Now, I want to divide the video about Scorpion into 4 parts. The first part, I'm going to give an overview and explanation of what Scorpion is. So think about it as like a definition. The second part, I want to back up a bit and get into more depth about the background of Scorpion and also of French Army approaches to networked warfare, because that's really what Scorpion is about. It's about networked warfare. And the third, I'm going to say some things about the status of Scorpion and where the French are today with it, and also how it compares with the American military and the British military, and a little bit with the Israelis. Now, finally, in the fourth, I want to take a step back and ask some questions about really the value of the whole thing, because I still think that there are a lot of concerns, lingering concerns, and also some lingering question marks about whether any of this really makes sense in the long term, particularly in light of things that we're seeing going on in Ukraine. Most of what I know about Scorpion and the French Army in this regard comes from a report that a study project that I led at the RAND Corporation already 10 years ago. And it was a monograph. It led to a monograph published by RAND with the title French Army Approaches to Networked Warfare. I put a link to that study in the description. It's a very good report. Click on the link. It's free. You can download the PDF. I think it's very good. Okay, so part 1 then. What is Scorpion exactly? First of all, Scorpion is an acronym, but this is a clear case of where they thought up a cool name first, and then they afterwards worked out what it could possibly stand for if you treated it as an acronym. I think in English it's called a backronym, right? So you do it backwards. So in this case, Scorpion means, are you ready for it? It's synergie de contact renforcée par la polyvalence et de l'infovalorisation, which kind of translates as synergy of contact reinforced by versatility and getting value out of information. Got that? Excellent. Scorpion technically dates to 2014, but as I will discuss a little bit more in part 2, it really represents a stage in the development of what the French had already been doing for at least a decade before that, and really even longer than that. And again, I'm going to get into that in greater detail later. In a sense, what Scorpion is first of all, it's a decision to go all in and to really lean into this technology that they've been working on, but also it's probably more than that. It's a marketing exercise. Somebody figured out that if you want to convince people to spend a lot of money on a big program, make it as big as possible and give it a sexy name, and somehow that this will sell well or better than if you just try to sell little bits and pieces of this program separately. So what the French, in fact, did do is they folded 2 separate initiatives into one program. One was to develop new armored vehicles to replace the fleet that dated back to the 1970s and 1980s. And the new vehicles in question are the Griffin, the Jaguar, and the Serval, which replace the French Army's venerable but threadbare AMX-10s, ERC-90s, and the VAB. The other initiative, and really the most important one, is the second stage, or the latest stage, of an effort to digitize the force and to implement networked warfare technologies. Today, when most people speak about Scorpion, I think they tend to have in mind the new armored vehicles. And they are spiffy, they're pretty cool, but they're really not what matters. What matters is the network warfare tech that's inside them. And it's also, by the way, inside the Littell and the VBCI infantry fighting vehicle, both of which, of course, predate Scorpion. Littell is from the 90s. The VBCI entered service in 2008. But all of them have the tech, and you can think of them as sort of Scorpion avant la lettre, right? It's the same kind of thing. Part 2. French army approaches to network warfare. It's all about the networks. The tech that I've just mentioned is the real heart of Scorpion. And by tech, what I'm referring to are sensors and radios, digital radios, and battlefield management software, all of which is intended to do things like provide different operators and commanders at different levels with a common operating picture to make the battlefield as transparent as possible, and to foster collaborative warfare, which I can discuss a little bit further, a little bit more later. The technology, as I've said, predates Scorpion, for it includes and is based on technology that the French started developing, well, frankly, already back in the 1980s and 1980s, but 1990s and even 1980s. But really, the real focus of the energy, the big effort came in 2000 and after 2000. I believe that the difference, though, between, let's say, the new stuff that's understood to be Scorpion, Jaguar, Griffin, Serval, and the older stuff that has the tech, VBCI and Leclerc, is that whereas with VBCI and Leclerc, the technology was integrated into the systems with other systems in the vehicles, with the Griffin and the Jaguar and the Serval, they're really designed around the technology. It's sort of like baked into the recipe from the very beginning. Parts of the Scorpion suite include a technology suite, include the new contact radio, and then there's a system called Antares. Antares is the thing that sits on the roof of the vehicles. It's supposed to, I'm reading this from the website, provide 360-degree images around the vehicle and can detect range finding and targeting lasers pointed at it. So the idea is you're in your vehicle and you could look on your screen or on your tablet or something and you could see all the way around your vehicle. And also, if somebody lasers your vehicle with some sort of rangefinder targeting device, you can know that, first of all, that is happening. And then Antares can identify where it's coming from and what the source is. Is it a guy? Is it a vehicle? Is it an aircraft? Etc. And then that information gets immediately shared on the network via this contact radio, which immediately uploads this data so that everybody knows all about that. Somebody's lasing somebody, and where is the threat coming from, who's doing the lasing, and where. Also, as part of this tech, there's also something called Vetronics, and these are sensors that are within the vehicle itself that monitor where the vehicle is, how it's doing, and then also in terms of the mechanical condition, is it running low on oil, does it need repair, that kind of thing. And part of Vetronics is by sharing that information on the network, the idea is that this can inform the logistics elements of the force and enable the logistics to provide exactly what's required when and where it's required in order to make it more efficient, in order for the logistics to be leaner. The French army, I think arguably, they really practice something like a Toyota just-in-time lean manufacturing approach when it comes to logistics. So they're hoping that all this data shared on the network is going to help them do that. To be clear, Scorpion is basically supposed to operate at the brigade and below level. The real focus of Scorpion is something called the GTIA, or the Combined Arms Tactical Group, which is, we would call it like a battalion task force. And then the GTIA has subgroups, the SGTIA. These are company-sized combined arms tactical subgroups. And this is really how the French operate on the ground. So yeah, they have brigades, but the sitting brigade, the standing brigade, doesn't go into the field. What they do is they generate GTIAs. And 1 or 2 or 3 GTIAs are then called a brigade, and there's a brigade level element. But the GTIAs themselves are often made of elements cobbled together from other brigades. So the real operating unit, though, is really the GTIA and the SGTIA. And that's the scope of what Scorpion is supposed to do. It's supposed to enhance the ability of the GTIAs and the SGTIAs to function and to collaborate. If you want to know more about that, you can read about it in the RAND report on French Army Approaches Network Warfare. There's also a report I wrote for RAND about Operation Serval, which also gets into this stuff, like the structure of the GTIA and the SGTA. Again, I put a link in the description. If you look at this slide here, which I pulled from some French Army document, you can see that, like, here you've got the PC as the headquarters, so you've got like the division headquarters, and then you've got a brigade headquarters, but the Scorpion is providing a bubble around the GTIA and the SGTIA, and in section, that's the French word for platoon. So that's where it is. Now, currently the French are working on expanding the bubble to include more of the force and also more of the joint force. So like that's phase 2 of this, which they call Titan or Titan. Maybe one day I'll make a separate video about that, but not now. All right, so let's talk briefly about collaborative warfare. This is kind of arguably at the heart of the whole thing, because this is what Scorpion is supposed to enable. The idea is that information is shared about the operating picture. They're shared amongst different platforms nearly instantaneously using a fairly broadband network. And the idea is that all the elements in your GTIA and SGTIA, as you're maneuvering around, you can see exactly where everybody is, and you can share all the information that you've got about where everybody is and also where the enemy is. So you've got both blue team, right? And they're really into Blue Force Tracker. I'll say more about that later. Also red team information and really anything else. It's all supposed to be shared and supposed to be shared automatically. With collaborative warfare, the idea is that somebody that's part of your formation detects a threat. Let's imagine it's like a guy with an anti-tank missile. Not everybody can see it. In fact, the person most threatened by that anti-tank missile perhaps can't see the thing at all. So imagine it's a guy who represents a threat to a tank. The guys in the tank have no idea, but somebody, maybe it's a drone, maybe it's a guy, a dismounted guy, maybe it's a VBCI, maybe it's something, somebody sees it. The information gets shared, and the system and people involved then very quickly figure out like how to deal with it. Like, oh, there's a guy, that VBCI over there is best situated to take a shot using its cannon. So then they're going to do it. Now, as part of the technology, the French have what's called slew to queue. Slew to queue refers to the ability to automatically slew or move the cannon barrel into position so that it could shoot accurately, precisely at a target. Now, slew queue means that the data, the targeting data gets fed into the machine, fed into the tank or the VBCI or whatever, and then that gun turret then does this, and it does automatically. So it's no longer the situation where like the guys in the tank are having to, they're moving the turret around, they've got to line up the scopes or anything like that. No, it's all done automatically, such that all they need to do is pull the trigger and the target will accurately be dealt with. The French do not fully automate the system as a matter of policy. Like all Western armies that I'm aware of, they believe in keeping something called the man in the loop. The idea is that you don't want this thing to run automatically for all sorts of legal reasons, ethical reasons, and also there's a real risk of being gamed. If you're running up against an opponent that's very savvy and they know that you will fire automatically in response to certain cues, then they will game you and basically force you to fire at stuff that you probably shouldn't be firing at, and perhaps not firing at other things that you should be firing at. So for instance, it's not at all implausible that the enemy might induce you to fire at an empty building, or worse, fire at a school full of kids, right? I could easily see this happening, frankly, in like Gaza. So that's why systems, they want there to be a man in the loop. Now, I've always wondered whether or not you could just flip a switch in the back of the box inside a Littell or whatever to turn the thing fully automatic. And by the way, I asked a French general who for a while was in charge of the Scorpion program, is this true? Can you just flip a switch and make the thing fully automatic? He did not answer the question, but he did say that it was inevitable that it was going to become fully automatic because it's all about speed, right? If you go fully automatic, you can respond faster. And often in battle, whoever responds fastest is going to win. At least that's the thinking. So they feel like, he said, like at some point, I think he was suggesting that the adversary will do it first, and then you have to do it yourself in reaction to the fact that the adversary did it, maybe. This brings to mind the fact that a key element of all of this technology, and arguably what's even driving it, is the insistence shared by all Western militaries today, and maybe just all militaries today at this point, at least the higher tech ones, is to speed up the so-called OODA loop. OODA is a concept developed by, let's talk about acronyms, developed by a U.S. Air Force officer, I believe in the 1970s. I think his name was Boyd. And it stands for Observe, Orient, Decide, and Act. And the working assumption since then of modern savvy militaries is that it is essential to speed up this cycle as much as possible. You observe, you orient, so you see, you figure out what you're looking at, you figure out what to do about it, and then you do about it. You deal with it. And you do this as quickly as possible. And then you observe again. And you just kind of keep doing this. All right, now the real backbone of Scorpion is the battlefield management software, an application known as SICS, or SICS. This stands for the Système d'Information du Combat Scorpion, or the Scorpion Combat Information System. It allows, it's like Blue Force Tracker, but on steroids. It allows guys inside the vehicles with their display screens to see where the blue team is, where the red team is, where anything else is, and also to coordinate. It enables collaborative warfare, just as I had described. And the idea is for all of the pertinent people at all the levels to share a common operating picture, one informed by data provided by, frankly, everybody who's on the network. And it's also supposed to operate, there's contact, but there's also, like, you can jump from one network to the other. It's sort of multi-network. And it's intended to bring a very high degree of situational awareness and to reduce as much as possible the fog of war. Now, besides all the tech, the French also have been working on new doctrines and tactics in order to experiment and try to make the most of it. So if you're going to be using it, maybe you can tweak things and also thinking about force structure and how you would do all that. So they've been running, there's something called the Scorpion Lab, and they've been running simulations, and they've been developing new formations. So they now are developing what they call Scorpion Brigades, which are basically brigades that consist only of all the new stuff with all the tech, and that have been remodeled and shaped and tinkered with in order to try to optimize and get the most value out of the technology as possible. I want to back up a bit and talk about the origins of this and why the French got into this technology in the first place, because I do think this is frankly interesting and helps you understand Scorpion and the French approach to this. It all really goes back to the 1990s, at least thinking about network warfare, when the French were watching the Americans experiment with networked warfare, and the Americans were going gaga over what the Americans called a revolution in military affairs. Now, the idea is that with high-tech sensor precision weapons, networking technology, that this would all revolutionize warfare. It would radically speed up the OODA loop, and plus they believed that because of technology, you no longer needed mass because all of your stuff is hyper efficient, hyper lethal. You also don't even need mass firepower anymore, because instead of having to fire 1,000 rounds of shells in order to achieve a certain effect, you can fire 3 or 4 rounds with incredible precision and get the same effect. And you don't even necessarily need heavily armored vehicles for protection, because the enhanced situational awareness, they would call it, the Americans would call it information dominance, that this would make you safer. So you could eschew the heavy armor, which is awesome, because now you could have a lighter vehicle that's easier to deploy, etc. So this is what the Americans were into, and in the 90s, this was the era of what the U.S. Army called Army After Next, which was this whole program to completely rethink how to organize the army and how to fight and how to operate. And they did all these simulations and war games, and I know the Rand Corporation is heavily into this. Army After Next, and there's all these series of games that they would do, and the idea is like the technology would change everything. So let's throw away all of our preconceived notions about how to organize a force and how to fight the force, and let's come up with something completely new, because the technology mandated something completely new. And then after that, you've got transformation. Remember that word, the idea that the force would be transformed and you digitizing everything, and somehow this radically change everything. And then this led the U.S. Army to embrace this concept called the Future Combat System, which was it's 2000s. This is this huge family of modular, high-tech, super networked vehicles that could do all sorts of things. And the British had their own version, this thing called FRES, which is the Future Rapid Effects System, which again is like this family of modular armored vehicles. Everything is high-tech and super networked. Awesome. The French were watching all of this with real unease. And now, first of all, they weren't really convinced that the revolution in military affairs was really all that. And to this day, the French are tech skeptics. They're not Luddites, but they're skeptics. And they very often criticize the American military and American strategic culture in general for being overly enthralled by technology. And the French will say, it's not the tech, it's the people, the quality of the people and how they're trained, and the quality of the command culture, that sort of thing. So the French are kind of romantics when it comes to that. But also, the French were afraid of the cost, because holy cow, this stuff is expensive. And while the U.S. Army could afford to go after pie-in-the-sky procurement programs that throw around billions of dollars, the French can't. So that's a problem. The French are also worried about keeping up with the Americans. If the Americans were going to throw themselves into this, and also if the technology actually delivered, then this would mean that the Americans would just leap ahead of the rest of the world in terms of the quality of the military. And the French didn't want to be left behind. The French they want to stay, qualitatively speaking, equal to the U.S. military, even though, quantitatively, that's a whole other thing. But qualitatively, and they want to be able to contribute as equals, respected partners in a coalition fight, and to have a seat at the table, and to have a voice at the table. They want to count among the big dogs, and they were afraid that if the Americans threw themselves at this stuff, they wouldn't count anymore. They would just be obsolete. So the French decided that in around 1999, 2000, the French decided that, first of all, they don't have a choice. They got to do this because they got to keep up with the Americans. Second, they were thinking, well, maybe the tech isn't all that bad. And I think it really helped that this guy, General Guy Hubin, came out with this book in 2000. Hubin was a liaison officer, and he was one of these French guys in the 1990s who was observing the American experiments with network warfare technology. And he was blown away by it, and he got really excited because he saw this real possibility, real potential. And what this book is, Perspective Technique, which I've talked about before, and I also, I put a link to that video in the description, and also, if you look up here, there's a link to a video that I had Hubin come in, and I interviewed him about Ukraine. He's an amazing guy. This book's really amazing because what he does is he takes it and he says, you know what, maybe this could revolutionize warfare in some interesting ways. And he lays out exactly how it would work. And I think he did a very, very good job. And this book is kind of like a bestseller in French military circles. I think it was even it was a required reading in French military schools, at least for a while. It does not exist in English. If any of you has the wherewithal to pay me to translate this book into English, be my guest. Please reach out to me. I would be delighted. I think that people would really benefit from having the book in English. So in other words, the French are warming up to this. Like, they don't have a choice anyways, but now they're really warming up to it. And they start to invest in the technology. So they do it incrementally, kind of in bits and pieces. And they do this, they do that, they come up with a new system, they do that system. And then also, as they develop it, they fielded it. And they would field it and they would observe, see what works, what doesn't work. The French also watched very carefully U.S. Army operations in Iraq to see what the Americans were doing, how they were doing it, and how the technology was used, and how the Americans used the technology, and whether or not it was actually useful. Did it do the Americans any good? One of the things that the French saw the Americans doing and thought was awesome was this thing called Blue Force Tracker. Blue Force Tracker is this network system that the American military has, where these vehicles have these, I guess, transponders. And what it does is it enables the Americans to keep track of where all of their vehicles are at any given time, which is amazing because now you can look on a screen, you can see where all your guys are. Whereas before, one of the constants at warfare is that it was often extremely difficult to know, first of all, where you are, and then where everybody else is. And this makes everything very, very difficult. And I mentioned this comes from, I believe, an after-action report that I read, a French Army study of American Army operations in Iraq. They talked about Blue Force Tracker, and they praised it for lowering rates of fratricide. They talked about how there was this heightened ability to seize opportunities to maneuver on the battlefield by giving commanders, they wrote, precise and real-time information regarding where their forces are located. It's very huge because the French are all about you're maneuvering around, and you want your commanders to be able to see an opportunity and take the initiative and take and grab the opportunity. So they think that Blue Force Tracker enables that or makes that easier to do. They also saw that Blue Force Tracker alleviated the burden of trying to constantly figure out where you are and where everybody else is. And because commanders no longer have to do this, they can now focus their brain on other things. And they also saw that there was a greater capacity to disperse their forces and then to concentrate them at the right time and place. Something that Hubin wrote a lot about. I mean, ever since Napoleon, everybody was obsessed with this idea of you want economy of means, so there's a little bit of dispersion, and then you need to concentrate your force at a given place and given time to overwhelm the adversary. Because of precision weapons, there was a sense that concentration was actually had become lethal. You don't want to concentrate because then they see you and they could easily just wipe you out. So the idea is to disperse as much as possible and only concentrate at the right place and right time. And the French saw Blue Force Tracker as a way to facilitate that this whole process of dispersing and then concentrating, but only at the last minute, is really hard to do if you don't know where anybody is. But if you know where everybody is, now you can do it. Now everybody else can do it. So it's great. Before Scorpion, the French referred to the tech in terms of NEB, or numérisation de l'espace de bataille, digitization of the battlefield. There's NEB, or even NEB 1.0, with the implication that Scorpion is maybe NEB 2.0. This comes in several systems. So NEB 1.0 came in the form of different technological systems that they put into place. For example, in the 1990s, the French created something called SICF, or the SICF, the Système d'Information pour le Commandement des Forces, or Information System for Force Command, which is for the Corps, Division, and Brigade level headquarters. Then to connect the lower levels, battalion to companies, they've got the SIR, SIR, the Système d'Information Régimentaire, or Regimental Information System. And then below that, there's something called the CIT, which is the Terminal Information System. And then, like, for different applications, artillery, helicopters, this, that, they had different kinds of things at different levels. And so if you want more details about all of this, I refer you to my RAND report. All of these things talk to each other, but not particularly well. It's kind of this weird Rube Goldberg kind of patchwork of things. The throughput was weak. There were also classification problems. For instance, with SICF, SICF was at a higher classification level than the SIR and the SIT, which were at a lower one. It's kind of like, for the Americans, like JWICS versus SIPR, JWICS versus SIPR, with JWICS is top secret, SIPR is, I think, secret. That complicated things. The French did deploy this stuff, and as they deployed it, they looked at it and they watched to see, well, how did it do? So, for example, the French first deployed SICF to Côte d'Ivoire in 2007. And that, I believe, was the first operational use of the technology. The experience was very illuminating for them. And one of the things that the French realized was that this kind of piecemeal thing of patchwork of different systems for different things and different levels, it didn't really work. What they needed was a single, cohesive, federated system where everybody could talk to everybody else really very easily at a broadband with high throughput, but it needed to be cohesive, and everything needed to be much better integrated than was presently the case. And that, I think, really is what Scorpion represents. It represents the decision in 2014 to go to lean into this technology, but to replace the older patchwork with a newer, more cohesive, better integrated system. So that's Scorpion. Besides, they also really needed new armored vehicles. So if you could wrap new armored vehicles into the program, that's a win. Part 3. What's the status of Scorpion? By objective criteria, France's modernization program has been a smashing success. So first of all, they've got a new fleet of fancy new vehicles, which is awesome. To the envy, certainly, of the British Army, and probably others. There presently are about 100 Jaguars currently in service, with the number expected to reach, I think, 150 soon. There are 800 Griffins in service. The final number is supposed to reach, I think, 1,800 by 2035. As for the Serval, the number in service is supposed to reach almost 500 by the end of 2025. The French, by the way, have about 650 VBCI in service, and Scorpion. Again, it is Scorpion, but it's not. They've got all this new armored vehicles, plus they have been integrating the systems, and they've got it. So the radios and the battlefield management software and all this stuff is really being integrated into the force. It's particularly success from a procurement point of view if you compare to, let's say, the American Future Combat Systems or the British Future Rapid Effect System, the FCS and FRES. FCS and FRES alike were complete failures. Billions of dollars were wasted, and a lot of time was wasted. One of the reasons, certainly for FCS, for the failure of the American Future Combat Systems program, which is a gigantic, immense boondoggle, was that it was very ambitious in terms of the technology that they were trying to put into place. They were really pushing the edge of the technology. I would argue that the reason for the French the comparable success of the French program is that they were just less ambitious. It was less a shoot for the moon kind of thing and much more moderate, aiming lower, more moderate ambitions, and thus ultimately more successful. I think this is a case of the tortoise winning the race. Slow and steady wins the race, certainly compared to the Americans. The British case is, I think, is more complicated, so I don't want to say much more about that. I think that the only military that really has a superior tech, both with respect to cutting edge capabilities, but also the cohesive integration of all of it, is probably the Israeli Defense Forces. And I spoke with Seth Franzman a little bit about that in the interview that I did with him about Israeli ground operations in Gaza. And hopefully up there, there's a link to that video. And then finally, as I said, the French are now working on expanding the bubble of Scorpion to include the whole of the army and also the joint force. So they're working on, and that program is called Titan or Titan. So air and Navy assets are going to be included, and drones and whatnot. And also folded into Titan is the project to replace the Littell with the next generation tank known as the MGCS, which is a project that the French are doing in conjunction with the Germans. All right, this brings us to part 4. And the question is Scorpion any good? Is it worth the expense? Despite the fact that the French army is all in, if you talk to them, or as I did when I did the research for my study, you'll find lingering doubts about and concerns. It's not whether the tech works, like the software works, the radios work, it works. But whether or not, what is the value that it adds on the battlefield? And is it really all that? And is it worth the investment? Which is very, very difficult to gauge, to know whether or not it's worth it, even if it all works. But is it worth it at a much more like at a strategic level? The stuff is expensive, and it represents a huge bet on quality over quantity. And there are doubts about also what happens if you're up against an enemy with sophisticated electronic warfare capabilities, or an enemy that's smart enough to game the technique, to manipulate it, to do whatever, to sort of blunt some of the edge that this allegedly gives you. What happens when you go up against mass fires like with the Russians, or mass drones, which obviously, the French didn't build their systems to deal with mass drones and swarms of drones because that wasn't really a thing yet. So what happens then? And the French stuff, therefore, imagine if some Scorpion Brigade rolled into Ukraine, unit for unit, vehicle to vehicle, it's going to be vastly superior to what the Russians have. But on the other hand, doesn't necessarily matter, particularly if the Russians still have a lot more of the inferior things, So you've got your fancy VBCI or Jaguar or whatever, and it's going to go up against a whole bunch of T-55s. And you're going to laugh because the T-55s are antiquated. It's like chariots and horses. But it's not funny anymore when there's so many T-55s that they're going to drag down the French thing, however exquisite it is, or when the French thing runs out of ammunition. And, and a T-55 is a fearsome adversary when you've got nothing to oppose it with beyond throwing rocks at it. So is it really all that? There have been voices within the French army that have pushed back the idea of going with the technology. Remember, they're critical of the Americans, saying the Americans are too obsessed with technology, saying it's not healthy. What we want is more quantity, with a quality more reserved for the training, the proficiency, the commanders, and even suggestions. And I know that General Vincent Desportes, whom I did a video on separately, linked somewhere up there, Desportes says, look, maybe we don't want the new cutting edge stuff. Maybe what we want is just the old stuff, but just newer versions of it, because the old stuff, things built in the 70s and 80s is falling apart. So, but just make that thing just sort of new old stock. And then because it's cheaper, you can make a lot more of them. And then thus you can afford a larger force. And in the long run, that's actually more in your interest than spending all of your money on these exquisite systems. The French army also has flagged some concerns with network warfare technology. And this comes out of a number of publications that I found, including a really interesting after-action report about the Côte d'Ivoire, the Ivory Coast deployment of SICIF and the technologies that they had at the time. And when did I say that was? Like 2007? So they flagged the following. So first of all, they said that there was a real danger of flooding commanders with too much information. And the French use this absolutely fabulous word, infobésité, or info obesity, which means basically, just swamping somebody with just too much information. You're overwhelming them. There's also, paradoxically, the danger of encouraging commanders to hesitate for the sake of acquiring still more information. The French really believe that commanders are supposed to be accustomed to making decisions with inadequate information. And that's normal. That's reality. You've got to make a call even if you don't have all the information at your disposal. But the fear is that by providing them with so much information, you get them accustomed to having this richness, this wealth of information, so they lose their ability, their willingness to make decisions with inadequate information, and make them hesitate, and make them think, gosh, I just need a little bit more information. The same thing, the opposite can happen too, which is that because they have so much information, the concern is that the commanders are going to confuse what they see on the screens with reality. For one thing, they might not bother to stick their heads out of the turrets to look around, what's going on. They're just going to be staring at their screens. And because there's so much information, they're going to think, oh, I've got a complete picture. This battlefield is transparent, so therefore I'm going to make my decisions. When the reality is that no matter how good the technology is, no matter how much data might be represented on the screen, their battlefield picture is going to be incomplete. There's no such thing as a completely transparent battlefield. And so this false sense of knowing everything could get commanders into real trouble. The French are also concerned about the over-reliance on technology. First of all, the technology can be compromised. It can be tricked. It can be shut down. If you're dealing with sophisticated opponents, maybe they can do all of these things. So of course, the French, from what I understand, the French tech is shielded and protected, and they worry about this, and they try to protect themselves against it. But I don't know. I mean, who's to say how secure it really is? And then, of course, there's this possibility of it breaking. And the French, yes, are familiar with Murphy's Law. And then lastly, the French are concerned about the potential that the technology gives higher echelons to look over the shoulder of the lower echelon and to interfere in what they do. French command culture and French military culture has always celebrated what they call subsidiarity, which is the idea of, like mission command, the idea of subordinate officers being encouraged to make calls on their own and to figure out on their own how they're going to fulfill the commander's intent. Auftragstaktik, right? That kind of thing. Command by intent. But the concern is that the technology will make it too tempting for their superiors to meddle, and also the junior officers, instead of feeling empowered to make the calls on their own, if they're afraid that maybe people are looking over their shoulder, then they may not be comfortable making the decisions. So they might want to defer to a higher level, which is not, per French doctrine, not what they should be doing. Finally, though, there's also something that needs to be said about these vehicles themselves, the Jaguar and the Griffin. When the French developed these vehicles, and you should notice that they're all wheeled, right? Jaguar is wheeled, the VBCI is wheeled, the Serval is wheeled, the Griffin's wheeled. Everything now in the French military is wheeled except for the tank. When the French developed this stuff, they were aiming for what they call the medium segment, the segment médian. And the idea is that, you can only have one fleet of vehicles, but you need this fleet of vehicles to be useful in as many different kind of theaters as possible. So you can't specialize. And you can't focus on the heavy end of the spectrum or the light end of the spectrum. You want to try to do something in the middle as a happy compromise. So the middle segment the idea is that these things are light enough to be transportable, let's say, to Africa, and to be useful in Africa with relatively light logistical burdens, but not so light that they are not useful in a more conventional fight, like in Europe. And so thus you've got these wheeled vehicles. This is a compromise that the French deliberately made. If the French were to be thinking today and designing today new modern vehicles, I think they might opt for something heavier, because now they are really focused on high-intensity conventional warfare. They're really focused on Ukraine. The other thing about their vehicles is you want them to be able to go to Africa, right, to do an Operation Serval. But it's seriously overkill with all this tech and all this capability to be going after jihadis on motorcycles. It's kind of crazy. So it's overkill on one hand. On the other hand, it might be grossly inadequate for, let's say, fighting Russians. So you have to ask, are these vehicles themselves that they're now stuck with because that's what they've got and they're going to stick to their guns for a very long time, are they really a good idea? I think ultimately this brings us to the question of whether or not this stuff is any good for fighting the Russians. I mean, we don't know. In theory, if you go back to Ubin, it could work out exactly as it's imagined, where you've got these SGTIA, they're these armored vehicles, super spiffy, and they're all networked, and they're maneuvering around and dancing around the enemy and among the enemy, and they're cutting the enemy to pieces because they're so fluid, they're so fast. The commanders are making their decisions super fast. Whereas like these Russian formations with their more Soviet command style, like they're slow to react, they're slow to take the initiative, they're slow to move. It's much more of like a fixed positions, etc. And the French are dancing around them and just cutting them up. That might be. But then you have to ask, well, okay, but the French also, like, have they dealt with sophisticated electronic warfare threats? Have they dealt with mass drones? Have they dealt with mass firepower? Maybe the Russians will just laugh and take the casualties, but then because they don't care that much about attrition, they'll just keep doing it. What happens ultimately in the end, right? So maybe there'll be like a few glorious days in which the French cut the Russians to pieces, but then the months after they will suffer. I honestly hope we never find out what will happen. Thank you very much. If you like this video, again, please hit like and subscribe. Also, if you feel inspired to support this video, this channel more directly, please, I would encourage you to hit the thanks button or to join the memberships, or also go to the Buy Me a Coffee link, which is in the description, so that you can do so. Thank you very much. Also in the description, I'll put links to my social media, to my own Substack, which is also called Pax Americana, and last but not least, to my website, michaelshirkin.com. I look forward to seeing you in my next video. There's plenty in the pipeline, and I'll see you later. Bye.